So, Dragalia Lost has been out for over a year and a half now, and just released its latest endgame battle, Ciela's Wrath. I'm personally pleased with how the battle turned out, but I wanted to take a look back at how the game, its mechanics, and its progression have evolved since its launch at the end of September 2018. As of late, the game seems to have been slowing down quite a bit in the different communities I discuss it in, so once I go over how the game has changed, I'm going to talk a bit about where it currently is and why veteran players are having a hard time continuing. I'm going to have a larger focus on the permanent content we've picked up throughout the months and the updates to the game. When Dragalia Lost first came out, the only available content was the story up to Chapter 6, the Avenue and Ruin quests, regular Dragon Trials, Imperial Onslaught unlocked after completing Chapter 6, and beyond that, High Midgardsormir's Trial unlocked by creating a team of at least 13,000 might, which was a lot for the time. We only had 9 5-star units at launch, 2 for each element except Dark. The first version update that really changed the game was version 1.1 at the end of October 2018. This update, among other things, increased the Gatherwing recharge limit from 6 to 12, allowing players to play the game in 12-hour intervals instead of 6 to keep their wings from filling up. The next update that changed the game was version 1.3 in mid-December 2018. This update provided a buff to bows and lances, slightly changing their hit combos. It also made it so that AI would use skills while auto was enabled, because apparently that didn't happen up to this point. Also in mid-December, we got Hybernhilda's Trial. It was about this time that I, as a day 1 player, had just started to clear High Midgardsormir's Trial with the single invested unit Makoto, so I'll take this moment to talk about the state of the meta for these fights. At the time, players still only had a single slot for Wyrmprints, and most of our facilities were still on the lower end of leveling up. In High Midgardsormir, the optimal composition basically needed a defensive co-ability on the team in addition to the High Dragon Wyrmprint, so Vanessa was good, and Makoto was also the best DPS in the element at the time. Verka was also used in every run, as the fight had unavoidable damage. When Hybernhilda's Trial came out, it was very similar to High Midgardsormir outside the fight. You needed the Wyrmprint to survive, as well as a Zainfried and Nathaniel. Elasan was viable in some runs, but her inability to get full resistance to burn made the runs more niche for players who teamed up in private lobbies. Most of the runs those days had a Zainfried, Nathaniel, and then a selection of Lily, Orsum, or another Zainfried. The rewards for clearing these and future High Dragon Trials were High Dragon Orbs, of which we got bonuses for clearing 3 times a week as we still do now. These can be either traded for a copy of the dragon or used to level up a facility, both of which empower units further. It's also worth mentioning that at the time, max and bound 5-star dragons were not as common, as Sunlight Stones were also much less common. A known strategy to get Lily into Hybernhilda's Trial was to use Leviathan with a 4-star weapon to get the defense buff from it, or bring the 5-star weapon with a max and bound Poseidon for the HP split, as to this day, ranged units have inherently less defense than melee units. Also at the time, 5-star core elemental weapons were the strongest option we had, but we could not craft very many, as we had very little access to Twinkling Sand. Twinkling Grains didn't exist yet, and we only got 3 sands per seasonal event. It takes 7 sands to make a single unbind for a 5-star core weapon. A not uncommon technique was to use any Damascus ingots we got on a weapon, then dismantle it for more insignias, weapon tablets, and of course, extra sand for more weapons. This cost 4.5 million rupees, which at the time was also a huge cost. Max and bound weapons were very nice, but not necessary to complete the Dragon Trials or any of the seasonal events at the time. At the end of December 2018, version 1.3 increased the production of rupee mines on the Halidom grounds, and also allowed players to start trading farmable materials like elemental orbs between rarity tiers. Also at the end of December, we got our first new chapter to the main campaign, Chapter 7, and the introduction of the new mechanic of Bleed. Bleed was extremely powerful at the time. I'm not entirely versed on its potency, but I've been told that it dealt damage in percentages of HP, allowing it to deal massive damage. While it was very strong, the only content we would have to use it in for a while would be seasonal events and Imperial Onslaught. In early January 2019, the first Gala Dragalia banner was released, featuring Gala Cerise, who introduced the concept of having more than one resistance. This made her a great pickup for both High Midgardsormir's Trial, Imperial Onslaught, and any future Wind Element events. Also around this time, many early players were starting to be able to auto Imperial Onslaught reliably, as the total amount of summoning they did up to this point had yielded more units like healers that they might have not started with, as well as their facilities starting to reach higher levels. In mid-January, the Under the Big Top event added Master Challenge battles to account for players having access to stronger units and equipment. This event was the first very challenging one for a long time and since, as the event inflicted poison very easily and the selection of poison-resistant characters was very small, in addition to being the first challenge battle to have a master difficulty. To counter this, it was also the very first event that had Twinkling Sand as a rare drop, which we would see moving forward up until the drop would eventually be replaced with Twinkling Grains. Starting here, Sand became much less of a might gate. In late January, we got version 1.4, which made it so that co-op hosts expended Gatherwings instead of stamina, because up until this point that was not the case. It also gave players the option to host a room if they were unable to find one. This balanced co-op between hosts and guests, as in early raids, hosts who used stamina would also get more rewards. In late February, the first set of void battles were added to the game. accessible after clearing Chapter 7. The Void Battles were designed as intermediary content to bridge the large might gap between Imperial Onslaught and High Dragon Trials, and they brought their own progression system with new Void weapons. Each battle of progressing difficulty would drop materials for a weapon with either unique abilities or resistances to a unique mechanic in a harder Void battle. This created a trade-off between the powerful core weapons and the safety of evading annoying debuffs like Dull, which greatly reduced player strength. But by progressing through Void battles, players were given the resources to craft weapons specifically designed to help them clear High Dragon Trials, with lower stats than a core 5-star weapon, but with High Dragon's Bane. They provided slightly stronger damage output in High Dragon Trials, and while definitively inferior in all other content, were also significantly easier to craft than core weapons, allowing players to build a more diverse cast for High Midgardsormir and eventually other High Dragon Trials. The end of February brought version 1.5, which nerfed enemy afflictions a little, allowing frozen players to be freed in a single hit, and slept or stunned characters to be freed when hit by an enemy. It also allowed a player to continue a quest in solo mode if they became disconnected in co-op, because up until now, the quest just would have ended after a disconnect regardless of how heartbreakingly close the players were to clearing. In early March, the first Prelude difficulty was added to High Midgardsormir's trial, allowing newer players to practice the fight more easily, but without any of the rewards of the full-on challenge. But the next big change came at the end of March with version 1.6, which added the second Wormprint slot. This allowed for significantly better DPS in all fights, better customizability, full resistance options for welfare and 3-star units, in addition to survivability options. This update also added co-op room conditions, allowing public rooms to filter for players closer to their personal requirements. Game speed was also added here and made farming quests and doing daily events much faster. The next update came in late April, shortly after release of Chapter 8 in High Mercury's trial. With version 1.7, Wormprints were removed from the summoning pool, and the cost of summoning was reduced to 120 material per single across the board, minus the daily deal. This was only the first of several major changes in this update, as it would also shortly bring defensive battles, allowed AI to use Force Strike, added objectives to co-op, made dragons show up as the backdrop in co-op rooms for easier kit checking, buffed Wormprint abilities with twice and max unbound upgrades, raising the maximum numbers on almost all Wormprints and added them as drop rewards to quests, allowed players to attack enemies that were knocked over, increased the number of teams from 6 to 9, removed toxic stickers, made deathless clears and raids only rely on your own teams, reduced the number of clears we needed to garner all daily bonuses, increased the potency of all co-abilities to 5-star level, and of course, buffed Eldwater dropped in summoning and refunded players based on their summon history. In early May, we got Void Agni and his Bane weapons, as well as the Prelude difficulty for High Brunhilde. Then in late May, we got version 1.8, which made crafting any tier of weapon instant, and made AI smart enough to dodge because up until this point, they didn't. In mid-June 2019, the Mercurial Gauntlet was added to the game. By this point, early players had enough resources to invest fully into several units of each element, and the Mercurial Gauntlet sweetened the deal by offering monthly rewards for reaching certain thresholds a single time, including Eldwater and Twinkling Sand. The initial levels only went up to 20, but levels through 40 and eventually 50 were added soon after by element. At the end of June, version 1.9 raised the level cap for altars and dojos and introduced augments, which would not become massively available until mid-July with astral raids, granting players access to substantially more strength. Mid-July would see Chapter 9, which was required to unlock augments, and then at the end of July we received the first astral raid, Void Jeanne d'Arc, and then High Jupiter's Trial. The first astral raid was very difficult, as it was designed for players who had more time on the weekend to play more, and as such, the hardest difficulty had a 10-minute timer and a lot of HP. It was the first content where survivability became a real issue to grab Deathless, or in early cases, even secure a clear. Also at the time, we could not use astral shards in bulk. Galacleo was also released with High Jupiter, but I already did a video covering that. This time period also saw an end to ranged units being required to keep their distance from the target to deal maximum damage, changing it to uniform throughout. And at the very end of July, we got version 1.10. This update added alliances, which didn't change much save for a few select groups, bulk astral piece usage, and attempted the affliction change, but that part was rolled back due to bugs. Skipping to the end of August 2019, we got version 1.11. Along with a nice UI change to make the player's stats easier to read at a glance, this update allowed for auto in certain co-op quests and implemented the affliction change. Up until this point, all afflictions had a chance to inflict against a tolerance to resist, and if the affliction was successful, the tolerance would increment by 20%. This meant that bosses like High Mercury could be poisoned a maximum of 5 times. This change made it so that burn, poison, and paralysis tolerance incremented by 5% and blind by 10%, while others still by 20%. Additionally, afflictions can now overlap on enemies, so Bog and Freeze would no longer cancel each other out. This made several units that relied on afflictions, like Fleur, significantly better. In mid-September, we got High Zodiark's Trial, which was removed for 7 hours a day later due to a bug that allowed players to bypass the intended method of clearing. At the end of September, we got version 1.12, with the game's first anniversary. This added some pretty great new features like raid boosts, new co-abilities, an update to the item summon with Hustle Hammers, and Honey Tea. Unfortunately, it was also around this time that we received the High Dragon Trial Time Attack, which is where things began to change rapidly. Starting in early October, expert difficulties were added to all 5 High Dragon Trials at the same time. These new difficulties were balanced around players using the weapons that the dragons themselves dropped the material to craft, so the entry barrier was high. On top of that, Time Attack began at the same time, causing many players to only seek out strong players who had already garnered the new weapons, making it difficult for new players who had yet to clear even begin. To make matters worse, the first Master High Dragon Trial, Hybernhilda, released at the same time, allowing players access to Dragon Tier 2 5-star weapons, creating an even larger rift. This continued as each week a new Master Dragon Trial released, causing players to scramble to attempt to not only create the new weapons, not only to rank on the leaderboards for a chance to get some great rewards, but to even clear in the first place. Only Master Hybernhilda and Master Midgardsormir released during the Time Attack, but the other Master Dragon Trials continued to release on a weekly basis, and until all of them had released, only that week's new one was available, leaving all players who didn't yet clear behind. It was a dark time. The middle of October also saw the first release of Mercurial Gauntlet level 51 and up, which changed the way the boss attacked from red to purple, forcing units to take damage and requiring a much greater investment to clear, specifically using the new dragon weapons while still being amidst the Time Attack, and also forcing players to use on-element characters that could resist the damage enough to live. At the end of October, Time Trial rankings were announced in the middle of the Master releases, and we got version 1.13. The only major change to gameplay this added was that facilities could remain active from the storehouse. This time period also saw the first 2-part summon showcase. The end of November brought version 1.14, which added auto-repeat, making farming a little more convenient, as well as the start of persistent double drops and void battles for varying quests. At the end of December, after Chapter 11 and the main campaign's very hard difficulty were added, the first set of mana spirals were added to adventurers. Mana spirals were intended to allow older characters to be brought up to the current DPS standards with significant investment, and for some characters this was the case. Ezalith, who had been one of the worst 5-star units in the game, jumped to being one of the best. However, units like Cassandra and Botan would very shortly fall out of favor as new spirals replaced theirs. Other spirals like Eyasu only boasted larger numbers, and they also began to rely on the element-relevant Affliction, which for Dark had been Poison ever since Delphi released. In addition to spirals, we also got the first Chimera quest and Expert Void Dragon fights. The Chimera fights offered access to a new set of Void weapons that were better than the core 5-star weapons and significantly easier to make. They are also better than the Tier 1 High Dragon weapons outside of High Dragon Trials. Late January 2020 brought version 1.16, which took steps to make High Dragon Trials more accessible again. The Revive feature was added, the time limit was extended from 5 minutes to 10 minutes, and mentor bonuses were offered to players who helped other players clear for the first time. Survival bonuses and tips from Nut were also added as well. Additionally, the stamina cost for clearing normal difficulty story chapters for the first time was removed, allowing new players to progress through the story faster. We also saw more dark mana spirals, many of which just featured larger numbers in the Affliction meta. Mid-February saw the addition of the first set of Mercurial Gauntlet levels above 55 and version 1.17. The notable gameplay elements were that weekly bonuses could be declined, and the Agito quest time limit was set to 10 minutes. However, it's also worth noting that the unit Nobunaga received a direct buff, requiring no further investment from the player. Late February saw Chapter 12 and the Ebon Chimera. Chapter 12 was the first chapter to feature requirements to continue and forced the player to upgrade their facilities and craft a core 4-star weapon and a core 5-star weapon. Late February also saw the release of Kaion's Wrath, the second Agito fight, which was significantly easier than Volk before him. We got a few more mana spirals between then and the end of March, where version 1.18 added the Event Compendium and Chain co-abilities, as well as normalizing Tail and Horn drops from High Dragon Trials. This also leads us into our current month, where we've seen even more mana spirals, mostly Shadow, Chapter 13, the current version 1.19, which added retry to quests, mentor room conditions, raised the level cap on altars and rupee mines, and made all the easier void battles permanently available. And with it at the end of April, we also got Ciella's Wrath. Wow, that was quite a history lesson, but now I'd like to talk a little bit about where the game is now and why certain things are the way they are within the context I've provided. The different Dragalia Lost communities I take a part in have been getting progressively more quiet recently, and I myself have also been having a hard time enjoying the game. There are a few factors to note here: units, customizability, weapons, and content. Let's start with units. Gala Cleo probably comes to mind first when thinking about unit balance, but Gala Cleo was supposed to be a special case as a Gala unit. What happened was that Expert and Master High Jupiter, as well as the Mercurial Gauntlet, were based around her strength, which instead of allowing her to be an incredible new unit, made this special case unit a standard. High Jupiter became harder to access than the other High Dragons as a result, and Cygames responded by buffing other Shadow units units with the Affliction meta instead of nerfing the fight, which they eventually did with revives anyway. Speaking of the Affliction meta, the customizability in the game practically doesn't exist anymore. At the start of the game, a High Dragon fight required a core 5-star weapon and the High Dragon print. A maxed 5-star dragon was definitely preferred, but I know others who cleared at the time with the Welfare Dragon Pele, which grants 30% strength. These days, the game boasts more customizability, but it's only a fake option. The optimal weapon choice is one of two, the High Dragon or the Agito. We have a vast collection of worm prints, but probably frequent less than 20. And we never use 3-star prints anymore, much less even see new 3-star prints. Veteran players probably have or are close to a full team of maxed 5-star dragons for each element, one or two of which they probably use more than the others, or just one in the new case of Golemars. We now pick our own co-abilities and have chain co-abilities, but the DPS simulator will just tell you what the best ones are for the strongest characters you have. Honestly, with the cost of maxing co-abilities, it seems to be the only remnant of the work with what you got type gameplay the game started with. Next up is weapons. In the early game, crafting a core 5-star weapon was a weighty choice, as we had limited resources to do so, and it was also the pinnacle of strength for its equipment slot. Void weapons provided cheap, weaker alternatives, as well as weapon skins later on, and even the Dragonbane weapons. The Dragonbane weapons were not a bad design decision either, as they were decently easy to make and had a niche use, and core weapons still reigned in seasonal events. But then came the High Dragon weapons. These created a rift in the player base between those who had them and those that didn't. Time Attack also made it very difficult to get a hold of these when they first released. Now, a large argument I've seen is that they completely invalidate core 5-star weapons, but that isn't entirely true. Crafting a core 5-star weapon is still a prerequisite to crafting the dragon weapon, and we did need them in the time before Time Attack to clear seasonal events and gain the resources they offered to get stronger. This leaves the argument for unbinding a core weapon. It is true that using an ingot on a core 5-star weapon is vastly inferior to using an ingot on a High Dragon tier 2 weapon given how much investment is needed to make each one, and the only argument to still be made is that it provides 7 more sands, which can be used for Agito weapons. That being said, veterans probably have a lot of sands these days, and this was only a much better choice back when the dragon weapons first released as a strategy to craft other core weapons. The other major issue with weapons right now is that old materials are largely useless, like weapon tablets and crimson cores. Insignias can still upgrade dojos, and beyond that, buy dragon worm prints for Eldwater without limit, so it's saddening to see my several thousand crimson cores go without use. Finally, I'll discuss the content. I have not played Ciella's Wrath on Expert yet, but it looks like a lot of fun. The big question is, why would I play it more than once? The clear reward is the Agito weapons, but not only do I already have 2 maxed High Dragon tier 2 weapons, the only content that can face that level of strength is High Mercury and Ciella again. Endgame content has reached a point where progression only loops back to itself. Seasonal content also crops up several times a month, but due to its limited availability with Cygames wanting everything to be accessible, it's never challenging enough for players with full endgame builds. This doesn't even fully make sense, as with recent endeavors that pushed new players to clear High Midgardsormir's Trial and Standard Volk, as well as their frivolous handouts of Hustlehammers, it seems that Cygames is trying to rush new players to endgame content as well. I believe that this in itself is also a terrible design decision, as they are rushing new players through an entire progression that kept players like me interested for over a year, and quickly destroying their sense of progression too. So how does this get fixed? Cygames has already announced that they're working on new content with new rewards that don't increase might, and I'm looking forward to what that might yield. Additionally, they need to add more difficulty to the seasonal events. Yes, this will prevent new players from clearing it all, but we have event reruns for a reason. Instead of, I'm going to get stronger and crush them in the rerun, we tend to feel more like, ew, another boring event. Even if newer players are unable to clear all the event rewards, most of the rewards will be the same in the very next event for them to try and garner after powering up a little bit, and any unique rewards like epithets can be acquired in the rerun. We will be needing those new rewards for this potential harder content though, or there still isn't going to be a point unless it's really fun like Chronos Nyx was. Also, I think Agito weapons should have been 5-star weapons just like the High Dragon weapons, with similar levels of strength. While not extremely incentivizing for all players, collectors would still play, players would farm less and burn out slower, and it would also provide an equivalent yet different option for players to further truly customize their builds. I normally like to make shorter videos to entertain people, but I had a lot to say based on what I've been seeing recently to help explain where the game is right now. There are a lot of compounded issues, from Shadow being too strong to content being too weak, to builds being too linear and slow releasing content. I personally don't know how much longer I'm going to play the game moving forward, but I hope it eventually returns to being fun. On a few final notes, please use the send feedback feature to let Cygames know that we really don't like split banners. They have a history of listening to the player base, but please be polite. No one likes to listen to someone who is yelling at them. I also put together a Google document documenting the entire history of the changes to the game, which I'll also leave a link to in the description. Thanks to everyone who made it this far, and I'll be back again soon with my community written how to play.